Welcome, Bay Community. I have Daniel Weatherby back to continue to talk about emotional intelligence tonight. We're so happy, Daniel, to have you back. And let's get right to it because last time we ran out of time. So I don't want to waste any time letting you get right into it. I know you're
Okay.
really passionate about emotional intelligence. So here you go. Take the floor. And well, thanks for coming
Awesome.
back.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Thanks for having me. Hey, Bay community. Thanks for having me back. For those listening now or going to listen in the future, yeah, I'm excited to be back and continue to talk about emotional intelligence, especially in the realm of learning better communication through emotional intelligence. So, in a nutshell, what we talked about the first time was kind of like a background of like why is emotional intelligence important, especially in the realm of communication. And to sum all that, I mean, we talked about a range of things, but just kind of sum that all up, it's the core of it was that whether we want to be or not, all of us are in relationship in some form, and so being in a relationship, as good as it can be or as difficult as it can be sometimes, that learning how to understand my own emotions so that I can deal with things better, was what we kind of laid the foundation for. Like we talked about like children and youth, and we talked about marriages and just in relationships in general. And so in laying that foundation, I was just trying to show like all of us can relate to the fact that we have relationships, and so it's a process where whether that's work relationships, family relationships, friendships, um, you know, you name it, like any type of, you know, whether we go to church or there's so many just environments we can have relationship. I mean, even going to the barber shop or going to the grocery store, we can cross paths by people's paths that we see every day at the grocery store. So it's a level where it relates to all of us, whether we have one person in our life or 100 people in our lives. And so again, I laid the foundation of why this is important. And tonight we're going to go into more of like the practical, like, okay, I can relate to the fact that, yeah, relationships we all relate to, and being able to communicate better and with them in them would help in some way, shape, or form all of us. And so tonight, or in this presentation, we're going to go through some more of the practical pieces, both in some tools, but also just some like basics of kind of what goes on in the brain, right, in the emotional center and the logical center. So definitely a little bit more practical and relatable, now that we've laid the foundation. So as you see on the screen, the first slide, uh, once again, communicating that I don't benefit, I'm not getting anything from Inside Out. I just think it's a great movie. I'm excited next week to go see Inside Out 2 with my family. But yeah, just a really good movie that took really complex ideas and shared them in a simple way to understand how, just in a basic level, how do the basics of emotions work, right? So that's why I put up the slide. And so for emotions and logic, there are, uh, in a little while when I show the next slide, you'll I have a picture of the brain, and we'll see there's so many different parts of the brain, and there's different parts that relate to emotions, whether it's like core memory emotions or recent emotions or just certain triggers. There's also parts of the brain that deal with logic. And so when I thought about this, I mean, there's so much that could be shared. But what resonated with me as I counsel and I do different things are these points that you see here: conscious and subconscious, black and white versus abstract. And so just to give a little basis, not to bore anybody, but with conscious and subconscious, um, one of the best ways I've ever heard it explained to me is that uh, the conscious and the subconscious. So the subconscious is kind of picture like something that's constantly revolving. It's constantly moving, and in the subconscious, there's many thoughts that are connected to feelings, but it's in this constant rotation, and so there's no structure, um there's not an order to it. It just moves constantly, right? And so I think the way we can relate to that is if any of us have ever had experience where as we'll talk about triggers a little later on. But if we've had an emotional trigger, something happens and it relates to something that happened in childhood or through a trauma or whatever degree of the trauma, in the subconscious is an automatic process, right? So we can relate to it in a sense, like if we've ever had an experience where something is triggered and I don't really know fully what's going on, but I can feel it, right? Whether that's anger, sadness, or um, could be despair, or I could feel disrespect. I mean, you could feel a range of things in our subconscious. And the subconscious is super important, but it's also tricky. And the reason I say it's so important is because it doesn't distinguish between a good memory or a bad memory, or something learned that is maybe a good pattern or a bad pattern. It's just all mixed in there and floating around to some degree. And so, for instance, like one thing I always like to reference to is take a moment to think about the process. If I had to wake up every morning and learn how to retie my shoes and feed myself and put clothes on, and I had to relearn that every day, that would be agonizing. That would be such a waste of time. And so in that realm, the subconscious is a good thing because it has these automatic patterns that our system has learned. That's kind of where it's stored in the subconscious. So it's like we don't even have to think about it. It just tie my shoes. I know what to do, right? I've been doing this for years, right? Same thing with maybe even driving a car. If I've driven a car for years, I know what to get in. I start the car up. There are so much things which is good that we don't think about it, but there's so many things that we do daily on a routine that float through the subconscious that have become patterns and that are necessary. And we're thankful for them because it'd be terrible to like have to go through the whole day, relearn stuff, and then at the very end of the day, maybe I can accomplish something new, right? So we're thankful for those things. But the tricky part of the subconscious, like I said, it doesn't differentiate between good or bad. So it can also have stored patterns that might be unhealthy. Sometimes anything from like maybe I get anxious and I bite my nails to maybe something a little bit more serious. Not to scare anybody, but like let's say you believe that sharks are very dangerous, and so it you have this pattern that I'm never going into the water, right? And so it's like you don't get to enjoy the water because we're scared or terrified, and we don't even necessarily think about it at some point. Once it becomes a pattern, it's just automatic. And so that's good, but the struggle is that when it comes to emotional intelligence is that it's also floating experiences in there that like I said, with patterns. So it's like it's saying something like, let's say a parent was very mean to their child growing up, and eventually they grew a pattern in them and they didn't have self-respect. At some point when that hits being a pattern, that's in the subconscious. So it's like there's a point where I don't even think about it. I just don't have self-respect for myself. It's just I'm so used to it. I kind of debase myself and think lowly of myself, and that can be a pattern that gets stuck in the subconscious and it just rotates around in there because it's just become a part of us. And that sounds detrimental, but when it comes to emotional intelligence, that's where the conscious comes in. So think of the conscious as kind of like a door, right? And another movie that I really like is Monsters Inc., right? So it's like they have to go through the door to scare, and then eventually, like they find that the laughter is the better source, right? But think of the door as when I bring it into the conscious, now the door gives me a boundary, a structure, right? So it's kind of like it can be painful to bring some of those subconscious things up. But the reason I emphasize emotional intelligence and having to deal with this process is because whether you want to bring something that's painful to the conscious and actually deal with it or not is understandable. Sometimes I want to avoid that too. But unfortunately, the feelings of what is going on is something I'm going to still experience, even if I don't know what's going on. So I've had times. I had a time in my life, man, probably 8, 9 years ago now, where like I had gone through some stuff and survived. It was in survival mode, and I had to push things down just to survive. And years later, I remember going to bed one night and I woke up the next morning in a sweat and was just overwhelmed. And the night before, I went to bed and everything was fine. And what I learned was that some of the stuff the rubble that I had the house collapsed and the rubble was there, and I'd be cleaning it up, and I cleaned it up enough where like some of the emotions that were buried got kind of came up, and I just wasn't. It was just a lot to deal with, and so I 100% I was like, how do I push this back down? How do I push this back down? Because it was so overwhelming, right? And so I ended up contacting a friend, and we talked about it, and he gave me some good insight. And I did push it back down, but about 2 weeks later, it did the same thing. I woke up the next one morning, and I was in a sweat, and so I was like, okay, I got to figure, and slowly I wanted to figure this out, because I could continue to avoid, but I realized at this point it was just going to keep coming back up. And so instead of allowing it to control me or dictate what was going on in my system, I shifted to being like starting to chip away through a combination of things like journaling and processing with a good friend that I trusted, eventually getting some counseling myself. And it took a while, and it was, be honest, it was painful at some level, but it was also very healing. And so like I go back to the door in the sense of like the conscious is the door that allows us to kind of open it up, allow some of the unconscious to come in, because again, in the background we're having feelings based off of the subconscious. We just might not know what's going on. So the door allows us to actually start to gain emotional intelligence, to start to figure out what is going on, because I don't want this to control or affect me in this way anymore. And so there's a time, I opened the door, and there was a time where I closed the door, right? And slowly I started letting things in, and I learned a rhythm and a boundary to say, okay, I'm going to deal with it for a while, and I'm going to take a break. Um, and again, the reason I say that's important, because I think at some level, small or big, we can all relate to the fact that we probably had an experience where something happened in the background and I could feel it, but I didn't really know what was going on, and it was bothering me, but it was also bothering me that I didn't know what it was. And that's part of emotional intelligence, is conscious and subconscious learning that that obviously I don't want to bring it forth all at one time, but it's actually healthy to chip away at it, because the more that I understand what's going on in my brain and my emotional center and the subconscious, the more I can deal with it, the more I can understand it, the better I can communicate about it and actually try to resolve it, right? So that it's not just constantly compartmentalizing, but it's actually like addressing it, healing from it, and learning new tools and patterns to actually deal with it differently, or to eventually let it go, right? So that's one piece I think that's very important. Again, there's a lot of pieces, but I think that's one piece that's very important, because I found that especially as I counsel, but also in my own life, that's something common that I see pretty often. Of I had these feelings, but like I don't know what's going on. And so I want to present that, the concept, to share that. And then the second one is black and white versus abstract. And to put this in a nutshell, is the best way to put it is, when we're younger, like elementary school age, most of our world is black and white, right? It's concrete, it's this or it's that, right? And that's one of the struggles with it's one of the beauties, but one of the struggles when we become a teenager, our world shifts to becoming abstract, where it's not everything is black and white. It could be 10 different things on the scale, right? And that's cool. Like we're getting choice, but then it can be overwhelming, because we're shifting from a black and white world, a concrete world, to an abstract rainbow filled world with all these colors. And it's like, I think that's piece of what makes the underlying part of a teenager difficult, because it's I'm opening my world, and it's expanding, but man, it's expanding at a quick rate with the hormone changes and puberty, and it's like, on a practical level, I think this shift is a big reason why like attitude comes, and all these different things, because it's so much to deal with and process, right? So that's a practical thing to think through with teenagers, that like, just like I have a teenager, my son will be going to ninth grade in the fall, and so and my oldest daughter is a preteen, and I can say there's definitely days where there's a lot of attitude in the house, and helping me remember this concept actually does help me to remember that, don't get me wrong, I'm human. Sometimes when they have attitude, it gets under my skin and it makes me angry, and so that's natural, right? But again, going back to emotional intelligence, it's like, wait a second, their world is shifting, and when I can think about that, it doesn't fix everything or resolve everything right away, but it helps me to bring in empathy, because it doesn't necessarily mean I have to accept the attitude, but it's a process of, let me remember that they're going through a lot too, and they're the one experiencing it just like we did when we were younger. And so it's a process where, um, this is a very important concept to understand teenagers better at some level, but also to understand ourselves, because even though we're adults, like especially if we've had trauma of any kind, at a core, when we have trauma in our life, there's an element where our bodies grow, we get older, but trauma, a lot of what it does is, I mean, it does a lot of things, but one of the things it enacts in us is that sometimes a part of it gets stuck. Like if I had a trauma at 12, I might be 20 now, I might be 25, I might be 30. But if I've never dealt with that, there's a part of me that's kind of stuck at 12 or 13 still. So like I'm an adult, but when this gets triggered, I become kind of like a child. And so some ways, even an adult, we can be in a black and white world because parts of us get stuck. And so again, emotional intelligence is learning emotional intelligence, and we'll talk further on a practical level how to do that. But I want to lay this out to kind of just to communicate some core things that are important in dealing with the brain, both emotional and logical centers. So those are some core foundations that I've learned over the years. I think they're essential.
Well, Daniel,
As I said,
you're gonna love Inside Out too. Speaking of all the colors and how things get more complex, it just,
okay,
again, we're not getting anything for this, but it does delve
yeah,
into that, and it does a pretty good job of kind of explaining that complexity in the way Disney does it, right? Also, I want to point
okay,
out,
okay,
in case we get cut off
yeah,
again, I don't know why
yes,
this does
okay,
this to us, but I
good,
have sent you in the chat a link to us to pop up again. So for our community
okay,
members, we just might have more than one video that's on. So make sure you watch part 1, part 2, part 3, we'll keep popping on,
yeah, awesome,
making sure you get the full, the full 45 minutes, hour in. Okay.
awesome. Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, and that's cool that yeah, I'm excited to see it because that's what I've heard is that the first one was good, but this expands it, adds some more emotions, and so yeah, I'm excited to see it because I think they do a really good job of explaining it practically. So,
Yeah.
yeah, that's cool to hear. So moving forward, brain and emotions, right? I'm already started to talk about that. Obviously, there's a logical center in the brain too that we'll talk about a little bit too. But I want to present this in the sense again. I'm not a doctor. I'm not gonna go over all the intricate parts, but I wanted to present this just to show a basis of there's a lot of moving pieces in the brain, right? We got the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the brainstem, the cerebellum, the occipital lobe, and the
Parietal.
parietal. Thank you. And so it gives a couple examples of what kind of each section does. So I just want to point out the frontal lobe, thinking, speaking, memory, movement. That's a lot of things in one place, right? And so um, there's a level where when I think about the frontal lobe, it's often referred to as the emotional center, memory, or where like when you have a kid, sometimes when they have a tantrum or flare up, the emotion pops up there quickly, right? So it's and hopefully over time we start to learn to have balance. But I know like as a kid, sometimes it's harder because we haven't learned the processing skills. Our brain is still developing. And then as you see in the brainstem, there's breathing, heart rate, and temperature. And we know that when I'm going through something, if I'm triggered for something, usually my breathing, my heart rate, and my temperature go up, right? And that's kind of what that controls. So again, a lot of moving pieces. I just want to show that in the sense that we're not going to go over that all, but I wanted to. It's sometimes difficult because